Уважаемые коллеги, пока мы не начали, я бы хотела сказать, что у нас будут сертификаты через несколько минут, и вы сможете каждый себе взять, кому надо. Сертификаты участия в семинаре. Сейчас мы продолжим наш семинар и договоримся, что мы его продолжаем до 14:30. В это время у нас закончится трансляция, закончится перевод, и мы продолжим обсуждать технические вопросы и задавать вопросы, обсуждать, делать предложения. Все это мы продолжим. И наши коллеги, двое сейчас ведут переговоры по поводу того, как организовать данные, и они к нам присоединятся вскоре. А пока мы продолжим.
So before we took the break, we had discussed how we estimate prevalence, the data we use, and the modeling techniques. The second part of calculating YLDs is the disability weight. Disability weights are ways to quantify the severity of outcomes, and they are quantifying as a percentage reduction from perfect health. The measurement method that was used in the studies we employed is paired comparisons. And the way this works is that respondents are members of the general population are presented with two descriptions of hypothetical people, each with a randomly selected condition, and they're asked to indicate which person is healthier. So what happens is if you have a pair of descriptions that are of similar severity, you'll get quite a bit of disagreement. Half the people will think A is worse than B, half the people will think B is worse than A. On the other hand, if you have two conditions of very dissimilar severity, one is very severe and one is very mild, you'll see almost universal agreement as to which one is more severe. So that makes it possible then to rank order based on agreement and disagreement to place all the different health states on the scale. The disability weights that we use in GED come from two studies that have employed the paired comparison approach. The first is the GED 2010 Disability Weights Measurement Study, and the second is the Euro Disability Weights Measurement Study. The first of those is based on face-to-face interviews in Tanzania, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Peru, with telephone interviews of a random sample in the US, and then open access internet surveys around the world. So this is a map showing where web survey participants were located. It's worth noting that in general the web survey participants are more educated, often tend to work in public health, than are the general respondents. With the second study is the Euro Disability Weight Study. This was conducted in Sweden, the Netherlands, Italy, and Hungary. Again, it's the same method. There were about 30,000, 31,000 people in the general population, ages 18 to 65 included. What's really interesting is, well, at least I would expect there to be differences across culture in how people would judge conditions. I would expect in some places people would see one issue as more severe than others, and that it wouldn't be universal. It turns out we've done analyses on these, and we've compared responses in Tanzania, Bangladesh, Russia, US, Norway. People generally actually agree around the world. There's quite a lot of agreement. We've also looked at responses from in-person versus web surveys, and they also tend to agree. So there's not all that much disagreement about what represents more severe health states. People generally view things quite similarly. There are a few exceptions that are cultural. Most of these relate to mental health illness. People in Nepal don't see symptoms of schizophrenia as being disabling at all, because that actually culturally sounds very similar to talking to their ancestors. So they actually didn't see that as being a disability at all. So there are a few differences, but mostly people around the world tend to agree about this. So again, these are on a scale of 0 to 1. A disability weight of 1 would be a state equivalent to health. A disability weight of 0 would be no disability at all, perfect health. So we could look along this, and mild distance vision impairment gets a disability weight of about 0.04. Severe acute infectious disease episode gets a disability weight of 0.15. Severe back pain gets a disability weight of a little over 0.3. A manic episode of bipolar disorder is about 0.5. A spinal cord lesion at the neck untreated, which would be quadriplegia, gets a disability weight of about 0.75. So this gives you a sense of how these lay out. So these are the disability rates, and when we calculate a YLD, we simply take the prevalence of the outcome and we multiply it by the disability rate for that outcome. So it's a quite simple calculation. Any questions about disability rates?
You're not taking official disability criteria, but these ones.
It's purely based on what general population believes about severity.
This comes from population.
Yeah.
This is not really something that we make.
Is Nepal the only country which is okay, which people with schizophrenia has no problem, so I think it should be more probably spread with traditional societies.
That may be possible. I know, I happen to just know that example of Nepal. That's one that we know.
Yes, there is some discussion, for example, in some countries do not, in some part of this study shows that in some area do not give a more disability to the alcoholics. In some other, yes, give more. Something, for example, some topic that has social value, for example, using drug, using alcohol, there are not 100% same. But other thing is same. Everybody talking about low back pain and blindness is the same.
Other questions before we move on to results?
Do you evaluate somehow data on disability, standard data on disability in the countries?
The challenge here is that for us to incorporate data on disability rates, they have to be from a study that used the similar methodology, the pair comparisons methodology, and they have to cover all of the health states that were used in GBD. So if there are other studies published that meet those, we'll add them. That's what we did with the Euro study, for example. In GBD 2010, we only had that first study, and then there was a European group that did the second study. The methods are very similar to the GBD one, so we incorporated their results. So if there are more studies that use a compatible methodology, we'll incorporate those as well. So some of these results Moshe showed yesterday. This is the tree map. It's basically like a square pie chart showing the breakdown of non-fatal health loss. The vast majority in Russia is coming from non-communicable diseases. The second largest group is injuries, and the smallest group are the group 1 outcomes. This would be infectious diseases, maternal, neonatal, and nutritional. If we drill down to level 2, we can see cardiovascular disease, musculoskeletal disorders, mental health disorders, for example, are showing up as large components of the non-communicable. Unintentional injury is the largest component of injuries, and maternal and neonatal are the largest component of the group 1. We can drill down further again, And in non-communicable diseases, we're now seeing back pain is a substantial cause of disability, depression, headaches, diabetes, hearing loss, blindness, also quite substantial. On the injuries front, falls are the largest component, and on type 1, neonatal outcomes are the largest drug-related. In terms of...
May I ask a question, please?
Of course.
Is it possible to look at the falls, which are quite substantial, and to see the age of the people?
We can. I'll move your slide, please, and I can open the tool.
The question is it for the old people, or is it for the general population mostly? But later we can discuss it. Thank you.
Если вы даете заболевания, которые сегодня внесены в различные реестры, и делаете весовую оценку, ну, скажем, это как-то понятно, можно более подробно понять, что такое алкоголь в вашем понимании, и как там вы расставляете эти критерии. Спасибо.
Criteria for the addiction, for the criteria for the use, abuse, and addiction comes from DSM-4. We are doing based on the DSM-4 criteria, and I think that is clear. Is there any other point that I have to mention?
Okay.
So, go ahead.
So, still I didn't get it. From time to time we all get some lower back pain. Is there some criteria for persistent back pain or something?
So there's... Do you know much about the back pain model? Because I haven't been involved in it, but...
I didn't get the question.
Sometimes we all get back pain for a minute,
Yeah.
and then it's gone, and here it looks like a serious thing.
Right.
We first, in the discussion with the extracting disability rate, we explain example. We didn't say that, okay, this is the very moderate low back pain or very severe low back pain. We said that there is a person that has pain in his back, he cannot work very well, he cannot walk very well, he cannot go outside, he has to stay, and compare this with this. This is for the disabled. But when we calculate prevalence of low back pain, we, based on the different study that we have, that different study shows level of severity of the low back pain, we divide this prevalence to the different level of severity. And in the lowest severity, your question is that, okay, I have sometimes low back pain, or it is very smooth low back pain. I have low back pain, but I can go to the work, I can go to the kitchen, I can do anything that I want. Then it will get a lowest level of the disability in the total of disability for the back pain.
So I think your question was more about duration, is that correct? About having back pain for a day versus having back pain for years?
You have this like a big window, which means that it takes, it has a lot of window and stability. So is it only a strong back pain and persistent, or any type?
It's any type of back pain, and actually this is not unique to Russia. Low back pain is #1, I believe, globally, and we see it as #1 in most countries, at least most developed countries. So that's actually pretty common. Part of the reason is because, based on the disability weight surveys, people have assigned a pretty high severity score, pretty high disability weight to low back pain. but it's also because it's fairly prevalent, it's fairly common. So if you look at the leading causes, a lot of them are things we don't think of as being terribly severe. Headaches, for example, are number 2. But everyone in the room gets headaches now and then, so it's very common. On the non-fatal side, a lot of the things that we see coming up as having a lot of disability are not things we often think of as being terribly severe, but they are things that are very, very common. So these are the leading causes of YLDs, all ages for Russia in 1990 and 2017. The leading 5 causes have not changed over time, and these are actually the leading 5 causes we'll see in most of the developed world. This is a pretty common pattern. Low back pain, headache, falls, depressive disorders, blindness and vision impairment are the top 5, and they haven't really changed. There's been an increase in the rank for diabetes and a decrease in the rank for alcohol use disorders. Here we can look at the trend over time in all age, both sex YLD rates and the composition. So for this graph, what I want to note here is that we're seeing an increase in Russia in YLD rates in all ages. I mentioned earlier that often as health improves in a place, we see increasing non-fatal disability because people are living to older ages, and people in older ages tend to have more chronic conditions. If we go ahead and we adjust for changing age structure of the population and we look at age standardized rates, we actually see that things haven't really changed all that much. That within a given age category, things have stayed pretty similar over time. There have been some increases in, I believe that's chronic respiratory conditions that's going up, some increases in transport injuries, some declines in nutritional, but overall the pattern has actually been pretty similar once you account for differences in age structure. This is getting a little bit at the question you were asking, Elena, in terms of what's going on in age structure. So this doesn't actually break down falls themselves, but you can see the green bars are the injuries, and the rates of YLDs from injuries are the highest in older populations, and in general, in developed countries, we see a pattern where YLD rates increase with age. In underdeveloped countries, we typically see a lot of disability in young kids and in adults. So the pattern that we're seeing here in Russia is pretty common for a developed country. With over time, we see increases in injuries, we see increases in non-communicable diseases, diabetes, for example, increases quite a bit.
Daria?
But where is testosterone bump? Everybody knows that younger men, they're more prone to crazy ideas. And actually, a friend of mine, a former director of biology part of National Institute of Aging in the United States, he even painted a painting, testosterone bump, where he portrayed this increase in mortality from mostly injuries in young men.
I think we would see that bump more strongly if we were looking specifically at unintentional injury just among men. But we're looking at everything combined, so it gets a little blended together. It's a little hard to see what's going on. There is actually a bump in the unintentional injuries here, but a lot of it is diluted by the fact that we're including women in this, and women, well, they make better choices and don't get injured as often. Here we can see a global map looking at YLL rates. These are age standardized. So we can get a sense of where Russia stands in the world. Generally, it looks a lot like other countries in Eastern and Central Europe and Central Asia. We could drill down into Russia and see variation between federal subjects. As with yesterday, the 2 and 0 blast numbers are wrong, so please ignore those. That's something we're going to fix in the upcoming round. What I'm going to do in the next slide is I'm going to adjust the scale to really try to highlight differences within Russia. So it's the same map, I'm just adjusting the sliders on the scale. What do people in the room think? Does this distribution, again with the exception of 2 Oblast, does this distribution make sense? Does this look like what?
This is for which disease?
This is all. This
All.
is overall non-fatal disabilities.
This is violent per 100,000. Fatal.
Oh my word. Did I screenshot the wrong thing?
Yes, this is violent.
I screenshot.
Nobody. Yeah,
This is the wrong map, I'm sorry.
You see, if I may comment on the task that you gave us, in terms of mortality, the usual analysis shows that it's increased from south to the north and from the west to the east. And therefore, the bluish north compared to yellow south is maybe in question. And if we have brownish east, it's correct. So
yes, I think, Elena, your point is correct, and we can see in the west we have lower mortality compared in the east. And in the south, we have lower mortality compared. For the south and north, there is no a big difference. Because
in European part.
in European part, yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. Exactly. That is correct. Thank you.
Let's see if I made this mistake.
No, it's possible, no worry.
Are you going to correct that at some point? No?
We will.
Because people pay attention to that.
Before we actually release subnational Russian results to the world, this will be fixed.
It's like region with oil.
Yes, it will fix. It will fix in this time.
Send us the revised presentation too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the issues that popped up yesterday looking at some of the subnational results is that with the 83 federal subjects, it actually gets very difficult to look at everything. So what I did was I selected from each federal district the most populous federal subject. So these are the federal subjects I've focused on, so we get a kind of an overview of what's going on around the country without seeing all 83 federal subjects. And I also added Tula to this because there was some interesting conversation yesterday about Tula that it seemed to have some unique patterns. So what we're looking at here is age-standardized YLDs.
Sorry, we discussed strange presence of Tuva.
Tuva, I wanted to say.
Tuva.
This is Tula. There are two separate.
So it seems I shouldn't be making slides when I'm jet lagged because I made a lot of mistakes on these last time.
It's, you know, kind of ethnic civilization of cultural differences.
Okay.
Between different regions.
Okay.
But anyway, we have here two important cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and some other area in south, some other area in north, in west, and in east. Then this is a very good combination.
So what we're seeing are YLD rates. These are age standardized for 2017. On the left we have males, on the right we have females. And we can see the breakdown of non-fatal disability. In general, we see higher injury numbers for men as we would expect. For a lot of other outcomes, we actually see pretty similar estimates for males and females. St. Petersburg is looking like it has overall the lowest non-fatal disability of these, and Tula has the highest. And I also included Russia overall so we can get a sense of where
One thing that I want to mention here, if you look pattern between oblast is safe, do you believe that?
I think that sort of Russian oblasts are very similar to each other.
This oblast?
Russian oblasts. It's just Russia is very heterogeneous with some gradient in terms of pattern, poverty, and like south to colder places. Climate, which is related to socioeconomic development. But when you have other territories with other ethnic groups, then you see kind of differences in demographic patterns. So Russia is very homogeneous, not heterogeneous. Russian regions.
Right.
You come to Vladivostok and you see same people, same jobs, same problems, 7 hours of flight from Moscow.
Okay.
Here we see the leading causes of YLDs. Again, we're looking at both sexes age standardized for these selected federal subjects and for Russia as a whole. Overall, musculoskeletal disorders are number 1. So this is going to be primarily low back pain. Mental disorders are number 2. Unintentional injuries are number 3 or number 4, depending on where we look, but not a huge amount of heterogeneity there. Likewise with neurological disorders. When we get into substance use, for example, we start seeing some variation in the rankings with several of these federal subjects showing this is the 7th leading, and we have Dagestan, for example, showing it as the 10th leading. And I think this came up yesterday with alcohol use probably being lower in Dagestan as well.
Okay, we will talk about this tomorrow at the lifestyle for risk factor seminar, but there is a factor which couldn't intervene is how much people use private narcologists. If you have a chain drinking session, you can call in, you don't have to sometimes go to governmental narcologists and get into the report, into the registry of sick people. You can just call somebody, private narcologist, and somebody will come and give you injections. So, perfusions, some nice lady, you can even court this lady after this. So, and this probably explains lower rate in Moscow, Primorsky Kolrai, Vladivostok, which I told about, and some other megapolises.
This is actually pretty similar to what we were looking at a few minutes ago. Instead of being sex-specific, we look at both sexes, and it gives a slightly better sense of ranking. Here what I've done is I've shown the rankings for Russia and some of its neighbors. So we have Belarus, Estonia, Finland, and Kazakhstan here. Overall, low back pain is number 1 in all of these countries. Headache disorders are number 2 or number 3 in all of them. Falls are 3 in Russia, they're number 2 in Belarus and Estonia. It seems to be less of a problem in Finland. Just because it says the pattern in Russia is fairly similar to the pattern we're seeing in Belarus and in Kazakhstan, most dissimilar from the pattern we're seeing in Finland.
Because they were one country, now they divide to the 16 countries.
And this is showing the breakdown in terms of actual total burden.
Which one?
Neoplasms? Quite small. It's this little sliver right here. This is neoplasms.
No, plasm is this one. Yes.
Yeah, it's this little sliver. And this, the larger one, is cardiovascular.
Why is it so? Because of...
No plasm doesn't have violin. Violin, no plasm is very small. Because
Fish?
they will die or they will be fine. For some of them, there is some long-term sequela. Mastectomy, if they have mastectomy, laryngectomy, and stoma for the colon cancer, and one another. Infertility and impotence in prostate cancer. Other cancer, they will die, or after 10 years, they will survive and they will finish. Automatically, wildly from the cancer is very tiny part of the die is due to the non-plasm. In reverse order, mental disorder, violent is very small, all is violent.
So I'm mindful of time and the fact that I'm quite behind schedule at this point. How many people would like to continue to look at non-fatal results, and how many people would prefer to move on to other risk factors? So we could take a vote by hands here. How many prefer to look at non-fatal results? And how many prefer to move on to risk factors?
We will propose that you decide.
I'd like to move on to risk factors because I am concerned that we're not going to have enough time to get through
Okay,
it.
let's ask, when do we want Elena for the having second break?
About 2:30, why are you asking?
Because he wants to change the topic.
Okay.
We're supposed to already be on risk factors.
When we 2-3 hours?
If you want to change something, I can put my presentation first and you can work on it.
No. I'm just concerned that I was supposed to start the risk factors portion a while ago and I'm behind schedule, so I was...
No, it's okay.
Just
we will have 30 minutes more from the lunchtime, so feel free.
Okay. So I'm gonna actually move to risk factors because it's actually a longer presentation than this one.
Okay.
So the format here is pretty similar to the presentation I just went over. We'll talk about some background, look at the exposure data that we have, the modeling approach, then we'll get into relative risk estimation and risk attribution, and then finally look at some results with a focus on subnational results of pressure. So when we talk about a risk factor, we're really talking about any exposure that leads to health loss in population, that increases the risk of an outcome. And this could lie anywhere on the causal chain. This could be pathophysiological risks like high blood pressure. They can be more proximal risks like smoking, or they can be more distal structural determinants of health like income, poverty, and education. It's worth noting that a single exposure can be a risk for multiple outcomes. For example, smoking is a risk factor for lung cancer, ischemic heart disease, and many other things. And vice versa, a single outcome may result from multiple risks. So ischemic heart disease is an outcome for high blood pressure, smoking, and high BMI, for example. And because of this, we end up with a situation where the causal chains are often intertwined and very complicated, and it makes it quite difficult to break everything out and correctly quantify all of these causal pathways. So here's one example. On the left, we have education and income. which are related to each other, but also influence things like physical activity, diet, alcohol use, and smoking. And then those things are risks in and of themselves that affect ischemic heart disease directly, but also affect LDL cholesterol, systolic blood pressure, and BMI, and then those things in turn also affect ischemic heart disease. When we talk about this in the context of GBD, it's worth noting that the distal sociocultural type risks, as we discussed yesterday, we don't yet include. We're working on education. Hopefully we'll be able to add it in maybe 2 cycles. But we haven't yet begun to include those. What we have here in terms of physical activity, diet, alcohol use, smoking, LDL cholesterol, these are all risk factors. And in this example, LDL cholesterol, systolic blood pressure, and BMI are not only risks in and of themselves, but they're also mediators. So other risks act through these. Of course, ischemic heart disease, in this example, is the outcome of interest. And anytime you can draw an arrow from a risk to an outcome, we call that a risk-outcome pair. So smoking in ischemic heart disease would be a risk-outcome pair. Alcohol in ischemic heart disease would be a risk-outcome pair. So this is the vocabulary we use. It's pretty traditional epidemiologic vocabulary. The methods that we're going to talk about were formalized in an article in Epidemiology in 1989 and were used as the basis of the World Health Report in 2002 and all subsequent GBD analyses. We call it the Comparative Risk Assessment Framework, or CRA. And this works through a counterfactual attribution for risk factors. We're asking a question: what would the burden of disease have been if exposure to a risk factor was at a theoretical minimum level? And when we talk about that theoretical minimum level, what we're talking about is the theoretical minimum risk exposure level. We call that the TMREL for short. And this is a level of exposure that could be theoretically achieved and has the lowest level of population excess risk for all outcomes. It's worth noting we're not talking about something that would be cost effective to achieve. We're not talking about something that we actually plausibly could achieve. It's just something that's theoretically conceivable, that maybe it could potentially be achieved in some hypothetical universe. In some cases, the TMREL will be 0, so smoking is an example of that. There is no level of smoking that's beneficial, so 0 is the theoretical minimum risk. For a lot of continuous risk factors, particularly physiological ones, there's usually more of a J or U-shaped association. So we're trying to find the level with a minimum risk. So we're talking about things like high blood pressure or BMI, for example. And then in other cases, we're looking at things that have been observed. So for example, for ambient particulate matter or lead exposure, we look at studies and we see what's the lowest observed level of blood lead we've seen in any study. And we consider that the TMREL. What's the lowest observed level of ambient particulate matter? And that becomes the TMREL. To give you some examples of what these look like, for fruit, for example, consumption of fruit between 200 and 400 grams per day is the TMREL. For low physical activity, we're looking at 800 metabolic equivalents or more per day. For body mass index, the TMREL is 21 to 23. Unsafe sex, the TMREL is no exposure to a disease agent through sex. For water supply and sanitation, piped water supply with treatment and toilet with sewer connection. For intimate partner violence, it's no exposure to intimate partner violence over a lifetime. And for iodine sodium, it's 1 to 5 grams of sodium per day. So these are examples of some of the TMRELs and what we're talking about when we're looking at our counterfactual, what the alternative scenario is. Any questions about TMLs?
What about consumption of no fruit?
Consumption of no fruit would be quite a risk. That would increase your risk of quite a number of outcomes.
Yes, you're right.
So,
Okay.
so 200 to 400 grams a day is considered the level of fruit consumption with the lowest risk of, say, all-cause mortality.
Yes, thank you.
If you consume too much, the caloric excess will actually lead to obesity. If you consume too little, you don't get enough, say, vitamin C and fiber. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Do you take into account obesity paradox that after 70 people with grade 1 obesity survive better than people not only with low body weight but also with normal body weight?
I don't believe that we do. It's a fixed TMRL for all age groups and all locations and all years for this right now.
I think there is such a disease which name is sarcopenia, and obesity people have low muscle mass instead of they have great fat mass.
Yeah, so this is a good point. In some cases, the TMRL will actually not be the lowest risk level for every outcome, and we'll see some examples of that. We talked about alcohol. For some outcomes, zero alcohol consumption is actually a higher risk than 1 or 2 drinks a day. What we're looking for is the level that would lead to lowest overall burden. And that may mean that's not the lowest risk level for every outcome, but it's the lowest overall. Other questions? So we break our risk factors up into a hierarchy similar to our causes. Level 0, which we don't often talk about, but it exists. Level 0 is the aggregate of all risks combined. Level 1 is 3 broad categories: environmental and occupational risks, behavioral risks, and metabolic risks. Level 2 subdivides those risks into smaller risks, and in some cases there are individual, most detailed risks at level 2. These are not all of the level 2 risks, but I'm showing just a few examples. So within environmental and occupational, we have air pollution, we have occupational risks at level 2. Within behavioral, we have dietary risks and tobacco at level 2. Within metabolic risks, we have high LDL cholesterol and high BMI at level 2. We can go further down the cascade. Level 3 is mostly individual risks, but there are a few smaller risk groups. Air pollution, for example, divides into ambient PM2.5 air pollution and ozone. Occupational risks includes occupational carcinogens and occupational noise. Dietary risks includes diet low in fiber, diet low in omega-3 fatty acids. Tobacco breaks down into smoking and secondhand smoke, and the metabolic risks don't go down to level 3. They're all only at level 2. And then in some cases there are a few level 4 risks. Most don't go this detailed. So one example would be occupational carcinogens break down into individual carcinogens at level 4. So one of these would be occupational exposure to asbestos. So this is the overall hierarchy. It keeps everything organized and neat for us. In terms of what we actually include, there are 84 risk factors, and that count includes the aggregates. So it includes the most detailed and all the aggregates. So you can see the list here for environmental and occupational. We have unsafe water, sanitation, and hand washing. We have 3 different types of air pollution: ambient particulate matter, household air pollution, and ozone pollution. We have radon and lead, and then for occupational, we have a list of occupational carcinogens, asthmagens, particulate matter, gases and fumes, noise, injuries, and ergonomic factors. For behavioral risks, there are things like suboptimal breastfeeding, childhood undernutrition, micronutrient deficiencies like iron, vitamin A, and zinc, smoking and secondhand smoke, alcohol use, drug use, quite a few dietary risks. You can see the list there. childhood sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, unsafe sex and low physical activity. One not on this list that we added last year is bullying and victimization. And then the 6 metabolic risks are high fasting plasma glucose, high total cholesterol, high systolic blood pressure, high BMI, low bone mineral density, and low glomerular filtration rate. So that's the list of risks, we're looking at. They break down, yeah, of course.
What about gaming and gadget depending, this type of risks? Like gaming, like casino, computer gaming, or gadget depending, this type of risks?
That's an interesting idea. We don't include those. I'll talk in a minute about what our inclusion criteria are. I don't think I've heard that one even proposed before. That's
Say that again, what was?
interesting.
Gaming, computer gaming, casino gaming.
Gambling is a discussion that we started 1 year, 2 years ago. Gambling, gaming. There is no, because we have to think about, is there any data about that? The problem is that there is no any data, but anyway, this is a very important topic.
But blaming have less data than gambling.
Yes.
As soon as ICD-11 in mental disorder part, the gambling thing, so there will be data soon.
Yes, it's very.
ДСМ-5 включила гэмблинг в зависимость, и на сегодняшний день она будет также рассматриваться в НКВ-11. Спасибо.
Yes,
Right.
that's correct. We will tell up.
Other questions about the list?
Профессиональные риски, связанные с работой, как-то я, может быть, я пропустил.
So here's the list here. There's carcinogens, occupational exposure to carcinogens, occupational exposure to asthmagens, particulate matter, gases, fumes, noise, injuries, and ergonomic factors. Was there a specific?
Климатические риски есть?
We're working on temperature right now. That's actually one of the things I personally work on. We're looking at exposure to suboptimal temperature. We're hoping to be able to expand it out to climate change. It's a long-term project. It's probably going to take another 5 cycles to get everything included, but we will be including temperature in the next cycle of GBD. We've made quite a lot of progress actually on that. And then once we finish temperature, we'll hopefully move on to precipitation, and then begin to look at climate more broadly.
And what about light? The influence of light on cancer incidence. Professor Anisimo from NN Petrov Research Center researched this phenomena and published the work.
Are you talking about exposure to UV light?
To not UV, but light in the night.
Oh, nighttime light.
Light,
Interesting.
like not for the whole day, Sunday, but the artificial light.
Yes.
This is a risk I haven't actually heard about, and I don't think, to my knowledge, there's been any discussion. We are discussing exposure to UV light and cancer risk as a possible addition, but I haven't heard the nighttime light exposure one.
There is this discussion, but this is something that we have to rise.
Yeah.
Yes.
Not sure that sun exposure is really bad. It could increase melanoma, physical skin cancer risks, but it could decrease a lot of other risks because of vitamin D. There are very few studies on that, but some of which we have quite positive notes on exposure.
Yeah, we're doing the scoping on UV exposure right now. We're not finding as much as we had hoped to find, but what we're finding is it's consistent with what you just said, that the minimum risk will not be zero, because you need enough to get enough vitamin D. But then once you've produced enough vitamin D, there probably begins to be a point where you start increasing the level risk.
You need to, for example, work outside as a guard in Israel. Then you don't have too much vitamin D, but it's not very often.
Yeah, so that's one of the challenges that we've been discussing with adding UV is it's very easy to know how much UV light is hitting the rooftops. It's not very easy to know how much UV light is hitting a person because people spend a lot of time indoors and people wear clothing. So it's a challenging one. And that one's probably not going to be added this year, but it's one we've begun looking at.
May I ask about iodine deficiency?
We have that as a cause.
As a cause, but not as a risk factor.
Yes, this...
We have as a cause in the duty cause list, and we have in the in the duty cause list, but we calculate variably for that, and it's not as a risk factor, as a cause, iodine deficiency.
But it's geographically distributed in different areas.
Yes.
So this actually raises an important point that I don't think I've mentioned and I should have. We currently don't treat causes as risks. So one bit of feedback we hear pretty commonly is you look at the disability from blindness, but you're not looking at things like increased risks of falls amongst the blind, that blindness is a risk factor for other things. So we currently don't treat any causes as risks. It's not built into our framework. It's, I think, a shortcoming of our approach and something we'll begin to look at in the future. The challenge is, if we do it, we have to do it universally, so it's a very, very big undertaking. So it is a shortcoming. I don't know that it's something we'll be able to address in the near future, though. Other questions? We break our exposures up into three broad types: dichotomous risks. This would be things like solid cooking fuel use. Does the household use solid cooking fuel or not? Yes or no? Categorical. Water supply and sanitation is an example of this. We have the TMRL, which is piped and treated or piped and chlorinated. Then we have piped and filtered, piped and untreated, improved and chlorinated, improved and filtered, and unimproved and untreated, which is the highest risk category. And then finally, we have continuous risks, things like blood pressure, cholesterol, and body mass index. So this relates to a conversation we had just a moment ago. How do we actually choose the risks that we include? There's four main criteria. The first is that we need sufficient evidence for a causal effect. We currently use the categories from the World Cancer Fund for convincing or probable evidence for inclusion. And we need sufficient evidence to estimate the effect size. So we need to be able to reliably estimate relative risk. We also need evidence to support generalizability of the effect size. So we typically don't have relative risk studies all over the world. We usually only have a few to work with. So we need a good reason to believe that we can extrapolate out to the rest of the world with those. We tend to prioritize risks that have likely importance for policy or burden. So there may be things that we can estimate, there's good data on, there's strong causal associations, but they're not going to have a lot of burden or they're not of much policy relevance, and those will be given lower priority in terms of what we add. And then, of course, we need enough data to actually enable us to estimate the exposure. This process is somewhat subjective, and we've received a lot of criticism over the years because of the fact that this is somewhat subjective. And this is something we're trying to address. One thing we're working on now, and we hope we're going to complete in this iteration of GBD, to include GBD 2019, is a GBD causation score that will standardize this process and create objective quantified criteria for adding causes and for scoring causes. And this will also help us identify gaps in knowledge for risk factors that we're estimating for. And the way this will work is we've already begun to go back through every single study we use for relative risk estimation. We've gone through most of them at this point. And we're re-extracting data about the conclusion of the study, detailed information about study design, the nature of exposure assessment, the nature of outcome assessment, different factors related to the probability of residual confounding and reverse causation. So it's been quite a process. It takes most of our analysts anywhere from 1 to 5 hours per study to do this extraction. And there's thousands of these that we've been going through. So we've been working on the extractions now for about a year. We're almost done with those, and we're moving into methods, testing, and development to produce the score. The idea here is we're going to be able to objectively look at different studies and see how different elements of study quality affect estimates that we're getting out of those studies, rather than doing this in a subjective way, saying, oh, we think this study has some source of bias. We can actually do this empirically and look at the data themselves and see what the data say about bias. And once we have that, we can actually score each risk outcome pair from 1 to 5 stars. So things with 5 stars likely will include, say, smoking and lung cancer, things where there's a lot of studies, high quality studies, the evidence is really consistent, and we're very, very confident. Down to 1-star studies, this may relate to some of the things we talked about yesterday with alcohol, chronic diseases, where there's research, results are somewhat heterogeneous, and we're not as confident. And when we do that, one thing we're going to do is we're going to build into our tools the ability to filter results based on star ratings. So if you're a policymaker and you have a limited budget, you're not only interested in the burden, but you're also interested in how much you can trust that that's actually a problem. So you may choose to focus on 5-star risks or 4-star risks instead of the risk total less comfortable. So this is a project that's in progress. And I think we're going to have this included in the round of GBD that we're currently working on. Okay, so what do we actually do? How do we calculate this? The first thing we do is we estimate the exposure for all populations. We choose a counterfactual, a TMREL, which we discussed a few minutes ago. We estimate effect sizes, so this is going to be relative risks. And then we compute the attributable burden using a population attributable fraction method. So we've talked about the TMREL. What I'd like to do is move into talking about exposures, the data we use, and the actual models that we use for estimating those. So we'll move now from the background into exposure data. We use quite a few sources. We use household surveys for a lot of these things. Things like DHS surveys are incredibly useful. Administrative data are used, things like sales data, for example, for food and alcohol. Census data, vital registration data for things like mesothelioma, where it gives us good information about asbestos exposure. Environmental measurements, so this could be air pollution measurements, for example. And then we use trade, sales, and consumption data for things related to diet, alcohol, and smoking. The process in terms of how we get our data and where we look, quite a lot of our data come from GBD collaborators. So folks in our collaborator network have data in countries. They have in-country surveys, for example, and they share those with us. We do systematic literature reviews through the typical databases, PubMed, Web of Science, and so forth. We use the GHDX, which is our own internal data repository, and as data come in to the organization, they get put in the GHDX and tagged. And then in some cases, we do targeted searches. So we may have a risk where there's a particular region where we haven't found any data through our normal search mechanisms, and we'll go in and we'll go to government websites, for example, for countries where we're missing data, and we'll look specifically for those and try to find those. Once we find the data, there's often some challenges we need to deal with. Not all data are entirely accurate, and there's some known biases. BMI is a good example of this. Men tend to over-report their height, and women tend to under-report their weight, which leads to general under-reporting of BMI. So what we do is we take household surveys that include both self-reported BMI and measurement-based BMI and figure out an adjustment. How far off are people? We quantify that bias, and we use that to adjust self-reported data, for example, to account for those known biases before we actually model the data. Similarly, people tend to underreport alcohol consumption, so we actually have information on sales and production that we can use as an envelope, and we can adjust consumption patterns to actually say, we know there's X amount of alcohol consumed in this country, so we have to inflate underreporting to sort of fill that amount of production. So there's a number of adjustments that go into these data to account for these sort of biases. In terms of data coverage, for some things we have excellent data coverage. Air pollution, for example, our core data comes from satellites, so we have 100% data coverage across the world. We have pretty good data coverage for smoking, child and maternal malnutrition. The data coverage for low physical activity and lead are so-so. And then you get down to things like diet, low and whole grains, and the coverage is pretty poor. Looking at some maps, we can see what we have for Russia specifically. We have 2 sources in Russia for physical activity levels. We have actually quite a bit of data for BMI in Russia. We have a lot of data on smoking prevalence in Russia. I'll show you some of the data and the modeling that go into smoking prevalence, but we have a pretty rich data set on smoking in Russia. Alcohol is not bad, it's pretty good. It's better than average what we have here for alcohol consumption. Here we see some data on diet, including sales coverage, diet recalls, and household surveys. It's a bit of a mixed bag, but we have some diet data coverage here as well. Any questions on data before we move on to exposure modeling?
What do you think about the data that we have? Is good or bad? You have better idea?
I think it's a quite wide range of source of information that you can have a strong picture of the data around the world.
Yeah. In general, I would say the data in Russia for risk factors is better than non-fatal outcomes, but not anywhere near as good as causes of death or all-cause mortality.
It depends. Maybe your set of standards for your system, it's like, okay, at that level it's working. But in our view of our possibilities, we can do much better. And we are working on it now. So when you're translating us or big audience that, look, your data is so good, it's a confusing message.
Okay, there is 2 discussions. First discussion that unfortunately Russia, due to the many discussion in media outside of Russia and inside of Russia, they do not trust their data. And in the first meeting that we had here, everybody said, did you use Russia data? It's not useful. And all of the time I had to fight, no, your data is good. You should trust your data. And now we have this discussion that many data in Russia is good and we know. But there are a lot of other data that we do not know. You know about that. And this is the important question, that how you can introduce this data to us, and how we can get this data to use, to add. Again, there is no in the world perfect data. No, there is no perfect data. Never. In each country we cannot find perfect data. Our job in IHME use any data with the different level of quality, and some part of discussion that I hope that Jeff can go through, that is crosswalking between data. Yes, in the data, you have one good data and lots of low quality data. We can adjust all of this data together. We name this adjustment as a crosswalk. And then I want to say that, again, you have a very good data. We know some of them, we do not know many of them. How can you help us to know that where is this data and how we can find data and use? That was my point.
Есть ли у вас опыт, когда вы сами инициировали большие международные исследования в разных странах, с помощью грантов, с помощью каких-то вами инициированных сбор данных? Do you have experience of initiating your own study cross-country with the same questionnaires, let's say, and so on? I believe that it's difficult and it's costly, but maybe you have some experience.
First, let me say something. IHME, in the job description of IHME, there is no anything for the running survey in the country and gathering data in the country. We do not run any survey in any country. We are using the data that there are in the different countries. You have cancer data. 2 years ago when I was here, this cancer data is useless. Now we have your cancer data and it is very, very useful. Okay, we do not talk with Russia, pay something and run this study and give us the data. No, this is not at all our job. Just we gather data that you have. If you want to provide this data for us, we will say thank you and get and use in that. If you do not want to give us this data, again, we say thank you. We run our model, and based on the neighborhood country, we estimate for you. Because this is our job, to estimate the data, to estimate anything for the country. If there is data, we try to gather data, put the data, use this data. This is 90% of the job in IHM. But if you do not want to provide data or you do not have data, we estimate Russia based on the Kazakhstan, based on the China, based on the Armenia, based on the other countries. Because when we run model, it will estimate. This is this is the process that we are following for the data.
It was a very long answer.
Excuse
We
me.
don't do primary data.
Sorry.
Excuse me, if I may follow on that. В исторические периоды глобальное бремя болезней периодически развивалось очень плотно ее создателем Крисом Мюрреем в рамках Всемирной организации здравоохранения. И в один из этих периодов были проведены очень массивные исследования с одинаковым сценарием во многих частях света, в том числе и по факторам риска, когда вот эти вот вопросники изучались индивидуально. У нас этим занималась профессор Максимова, получила потрясающе интересные результаты. И в ВОЗе на тот момент было обобщено это знание и передано, потом Крис это забрал и пошел дальше это развивать уже в своем учреждении. Сейчас я бы хотела обратиться к коллегам. Больше вопросов пока не задавать до 2:30 после того, как Дарья все-таки душу облегчит. И у нас переводчики уходят в 2:30. Мы не успеваем с нашей программой. Поэтому короткий, быстрый вопрос, и дальше мы идем жестко по программе и очень быстро.
My question is, can you just show the slide with percentage, because we need it for the tomorrow seminar on practice. The percentage of good data. Can you show it?
Что вы хотите?
Пусть слайд покажет с процентами.
Please show previous slides, please, with percentages.
How good is data in percentage or rating?
Oh, so that score is something that we don't have yet. We're working on it. We haven't finished that. That's something we're working on. So I can show it in
No, he
2
wants to
years.
change it.
That's a work in progress. We don't actually have results of it yet.
Please continue, but remember please that we don't have much time left.
All right, so I'm going to move into exposure modeling. We use 3 broad approaches for modeling exposures in GBD. The most common is space-time Gaussian process regression. We use this for water supply sanitation and lead exposure, occupational risks, breastfeeding, alcohol consumption, fasting glucose, cholesterol, blood pressure. We use it for quite a bit. Here's a screenshot of the STGPR tool looking at estimates and data for smoking in Russia. Each of these bins is an age group, so this is 10 to 14-year-olds, and this is 80 plus. The x-axis is time, and the y-axis is smoking prevalence. So you can see we have quite a bit of smoking data from the mid-90s onward across all age groups from a number of different sources. And you can see the model tracks the data quite well. It's a good tool. In some cases, we use DISMONA to model exposure. So this is the tool we talked about earlier that we use for non-fatal outcomes. So we use this for low bone mineral density, for example, physical activity, unsafe sex, a number of dietary risks, alcohol prevalence. Here are examples of physical activity DISMON models for Russia. On the left, we see low level of physical activity. The middle one is looking at moderate physical activity, and the right one is looking at high physical activity prevalence by age group. So this is another one where we have reasonably good data in Russia. And then there's other approaches. These are very varied. For example, for radon estimates, we use a mixed effects generalized linear model. In some cases, we use geospatial approaches, so we use these for things like ambient particulate matter and ozone, where we have satellite data on a 10 by 10 kilometer grid. In the case of air pollution, the way the modeling process works is we start off with uncalibrated satellite-based estimates of PM 2.5, and these are based on optical density, satellites looking down through the atmosphere. We also have ground-based measurements, so these are actual PM 2.5 monitors that are picking up true PM2.5 at the surface that people are being exposed to. And what we do is we take these 10,000 or so monitors, and we use a Bayesian hierarchical model. It's called the DIMAC model. And calibrate the satellite measurements to the ground-based measurements. So we adjust everything. So we start with these two different sources and end up with a map that looks something like this. I will note that this is one area where we do not have a lot of data in Russia. We obviously have satellite data, but we have only a few ground-based weather pollution stations in Western Russia, and we have nothing for most of the country. So this is one area where we could use more data. Okay, so at this point we now have estimates of exposure across the world through age groups and time and space. And now we need to understand how those levels of exposure relate to disease risk. And we do that by estimating relative risks. For every risk outcome pair, what we want to do is we want to identify all of the published intervention and cohort studies that look at the association between a given risk and a given outcome. In some cases, we will use case control studies where the data are limited or where the case control studies are of good quality and unlikely to have things like recall bias. And then we synthesize all the evidence to produce relative risks using meta-analysis or meta-regression methods. As a general rule, we assume that relative risks are the same for morbidity and mortality for males and for females across the world, unless we see evidence that that's not the case. So if we have studies looking at relative risks for morbidity and mortality, and they suggest significantly different relative risks, we'll model those separately. If we don't see evidence that they're different, we model them all together. In terms of identifying the published studies, we do a systematic search of PubMed and Web of Science and EBSCO and so forth. We extract the effect sizes, the sample sizes, all the confounders used to control effect sizes. And in some cases, this work has been done by collaborator networks, expert groups that we work with. Air pollution is a very good example of this. We have a really engaged network of air pollution experts around the world who do a lot of this work for us. So we've discussed a little bit about this yesterday and the challenges of confounding. What we want to do is we want to use effect sizes that are adjusted for confounders, but not for factors along the causal pathway. So for example, fruit consumption is associated with ischemic heart disease. And there's a number of factors out there like age, gender, income and education, physical activity, smoking. All of these things are connected. And they confound the association between fruit consumption and ischemic heart disease. We want to adjust for everything in this graph that's in orange. Those are all the confounders. So we want to make sure that whatever model we're using relative risks that have been adjusted for all of these potential confounders. But we don't want to adjust for the things in blue. We want to leave the effect of the mediators intact. Because even though fruit consumption, the effect may be mediated through BMI, that's still a real effect. That's still an effect of fruit on ischemic heart disease. So we don't adjust for mediators, but we do adjust for confounders. In the simplest case, we do a standard conventional meta-analysis. We typically use random effects meta-analysis to control for variation across studies. In many cases, we use meta-regression with predictor covariates that help us explain some variation between studies and maybe help us predict variations in relative risks as well. And there are some cases where we use the DISMOD tool to estimate relative risks. This is typically the case where we have age-specific relative risks and we're trying to estimate the age pattern relative risks. So this is usually most straightforward for binary and categorical risks. We're simply comparing risk of an outcome between different categories. For example, here we're looking at diarrhea risk as it relates to breastfeeding. Exclusive breastfeeding is associated with the lowest risk of diarrhea. Predominant breastfeeding has about a 26% increase in risk. Partial breastfeeding about a 68% increase in risk. And no breastfeeding at all, about 165% increase in risk. So these are fairly straightforward analyses when we're dealing with these sort of categorical exposures. Things get more complicated when we're dealing with continuous exposures. This is looking at BMI and relationships between various health outcomes, and these are nonlinear associations. So some of the ones I wanted to show, I actually added these to my slides yesterday based on the conversation we had about alcohol and chronic disease. So you can see the data are messy. This is the relationship between alcohol consumption and standard drinks per day and ischemic heart disease with females on the left and males on the right. The data are very, very messy. They're very heterogeneous. And you can see the confidence intervals for our estimates are very, very wide. This is also true of stroke. It's a messy association, lots of heterogeneous data, big, big confidence intervals.
What do you mean, standard?
Standard drink per day is 1 shot of liquor, 1 beer, 1 glass of wine. I don't remember how many grams of ethanol it converts to, but it's 1 serving of ethanol. So we convert whatever type of alcohol that we're consuming into grams of ethanol. Again, ischemic stroke, quite messy. Diabetes. Our confidence intervals tell the story. We really don't know what's going on here. We think there's an increasing risk. That's what the data suggests, but it's not a very strong, clean association. There are some where the associations are much better. Here's colon and rectal cancer. The data are still quite messy, but the association is much cleaner. Breast cancer, again, the association is a little bit cleaner despite the fact that the data are very, very heterogeneous. I don't think I have the liver cancer one in here.
For what?
Liver cancer and alcohol consumption.
For liver cancer and alcohol consumption,
It's going to be one of the better associations.
yes, but we do not have.
This is tuberculosis. So now we're moving into infectious diseases, and you can see the association with tuberculosis is neater. There's a lot less data, but they're telling a much cleaner story, general increase in risk. So this is the general process we use. And as it relates to the conversation yesterday, the relative risks with regard to alcohol and chronic disease are not as conclusive as we might like them to be, and there's definitely a lot of room for debate around those. All right, so once we have our exposure, we have our TMRELs, and we have our relative risks, we have all of the pieces we need to actually estimate attributable burden. The way we estimate attributable burden is using population attributable fraction. So the population attributable fraction is the proportion of all of the burden of this particular outcome that is attributable to a given risk factor. And we calculate the attributable burden as the burden times the path. For binary and categorical exposures, path calculation is relatively straightforward. You can see this is the equation to calculate paths based on prevalence and relative risk for binary exposure. And then this is the equation we use for a categorical exposure. These are straight out of any basic epidemiologic textbook. For example, this would be calculating, looking at ischemic heart disease and smoking. We're plugging in one of the categories here. If the prevalence of smoking is 15%, the relative risk is 2.95, and the reference category is a non-smoker, obviously with a relative risk of 1. We can plug those numbers in to calculate the path from that level of smoking. For continuous risks, the calculation becomes a bit more challenging, and we have to bring some calculus into the equation, but basically it's conceptually similar to what we're doing for categorical risks. We're essentially doing an integrated function as opposed to a categorical function. There are a few risks for which we do direct path estimation. These are risks where we don't do exposure and relative risk estimation, but we actually directly estimate the path. HIV and unsafe sex is the most common, this is a common example that we use. There's actually a lot of research out there that gets at people who have HIV, what the most likely path of acquisition was. And those studies say we looked at 1,000 people with HIV, and X percentage acquired through unsafe sex, Y percentage acquired through injection drug use, and so forth. So it's actually, in this case, easier and a more data-rich environment to directly calculate those paths from the literature. We don't use this for a lot. We use this for only a handful of risks. So what I've been talking about up to this point is calculating paths for individual risks and individual outcomes. We looked earlier at the risk hierarchy, and there's risk aggregates. So we have multiple types of tobacco use, for example, or multiple occupational risks, or multiple types of air pollution. Quite often what's of interest to policymakers are those aggregates. You cannot actually take a simple sum of paths. It doesn't work out. You'll actually get numbers that exceed 100% a lot of the time. So the way we do this is we use a multiplicative aggregation. So it's 1 minus the path. We take the product of 1 minus the path for all of the risks that we're interested in, and then we take 1 minus that product, and that gives us a joint path. The caveat here is we're assuming that each of these risks is independent. That's not always true. In some cases this is true, but we've discussed mediation, we've discussed the fact that, for example, fruit consumption is a risk factor for ischemic heart disease, but some of that risk runs through systolic blood pressure and BMI. So where we have mediation, this gets a little bit more complicated. What we have here are direct pathways between a number of risk factors that we estimate in ischemic heart disease. So there are direct connections between physical activity, smoking, diet, alcohol, BMI, systolic blood pressure, cholesterol, fasting plasma glucose. All of these things are directly connected to ischemic heart disease. But they're also connected through mediation. So for example, physical activity has connections to ischemic heart disease that run through the effect on systolic blood pressure. It has connections that run through the effect on cholesterol, through the effect on BMI. Similarly, smoking has direct effects, but it also has effects that run through these other risk factors. Diet, the same. It has direct effects, but it has effects that run through the other mediators. And alcohol as well has direct effects, but it also affects BMI, for example. So the simple path aggregation approach I showed before doesn't work in this case. We'll be double counting risk if we do it that way. What we end up doing in the case of these mediators is we try to understand what all the mediation pathways are. And we develop a matrix of mediation factors. For each mediator, what we want to do is we want to calculate the percentage of the excess risk that's a function of mediation. So what percentage of the excess risk from physical activity is mediated through systolic blood pressure? What percentage is mediated through cholesterol? What percentage is mediated through BMI? And the way we do this is we go back and we rerun those relative risk analyses, but this time we do adjust for those mediators. So we run the models with relative risks that are adjusted for mediators to remove the effect of the mediation. And we do all the combinations of these and come up with a matrix of these mediation factors. And they're simply percentage reductions. What percentage of physical activity is mediated through each of these things, for example. And then we can go back to the equation that we looked at a minute ago, but now we can adjust for those mediation factors. So where we have mediation, we actually subtract out the mediation factor in this equation, remove the mediation so that the piece of physical activity that's mediated through BMI, for example, is not double counted when we add BMI and physical activity together. It's only counted once. So once we've done that and we have all the paths, it's simple multiplication. All we do is we multiply the path times whatever estimate of burden we're looking at, whether that be DALYs, YLLs, YLDs, we multiply those together, and that gives us the attributable burden. So that part of it is actually quite simple. The mediation analysis is quite challenging. Okay. So there's one last bit that I want to talk about. This is something called the summary exposure value. I love these. I think they're wonderful. They drive many, many people crazy. So I want to take a couple of minutes to explain them, what they are, how they work, how we calculate them. The motivation for developing the summary exposure value, which we abbreviate the SIV, is that when you have binary risks, it's very easy to summarize the risk. 28% of people use solid cooking fuels. Easy, done. But when you have something that's categorical or continuous, it's much, much more difficult to give a single number summary of risk. I can tell you that 10% of the population smokes, but what does that mean for risk? It matters a lot depending on how much they smoke. If 10% of the population smokes, on average 5 cigarettes per day, that's a very different risk profile than if 10% of the population smokes an average of 30 cigarettes per day. The idea of the SEV is to integrate all the information we have about the exposure levels and the risk associated with those exposure levels into a single risk-weighted prevalence measure. Conceptually, this is the way it works. SEVs can range from 0 to 1. A 7-0 means nobody in the population goes to the maximum risk exposure level. Everyone in the population has the very worst type of water supply. Everyone in the population smokes the maximum number of cigarettes per day that we observe anywhere. So this is the very worst it can possibly be. A 7.5 could result from 100% of the population being exposed to half of the maximum risk level, or it could result from 50% of the population being exposed to the maximum risk level, or any combination of numbers that would work out to that. So it's simply a risk-weighted prevalence. If you hear a number 0, there's no risk. If you hear a number 1, it's the worst it could possibly be, and anything in between. Conceptually, does that make sense? And the calculation is actually pretty straightforward. So we go through and we take the prevalence of every exposure level and we multiply it out by the relative risk minus 1, so the excess risk associated with that exposure level. For continuous risks, we have a similar version, but it integrates rather than just doing a simple sum. And that's really all it is. It's all reference to the maximum relative risk that we observe anywhere in the world. So that's the SEV. I find it a very handy way to think about risk. I think it's a nice summary measure. I'll note one thing about this. Our estimates of exposure and our estimates of relative risk for a given country can be exactly the same in 2 cycles of the global burden of disease, and the SEVs can change dramatically. And they can change dramatically if the max relative risk changes. So if we have an update of the global burden of disease, and we now estimate a higher exposure level in some other population than we estimated before, and the relative risk max changes, then all of the SEVs change globally. So SEVs are not comparable between different cycles of GBD, but within a cycle of GBD, they're all comparable. Okay. So that's relative risk methods. At this point, where are we on time? Okay. Should we do questions on methods now before we get the results, or do you want to put them on?
Yes.
Okay. So let's. Does anyone have questions on methods before we look at results? Everyone is tired. Okay. Okay, so here we're looking at the leading risk factors in Russia for deaths in all ages. This is not age standardized, looking at 1890 and 2017. First 5 risks have not changed. High systolic blood pressure is number 1. High LDL cholesterol number 2. Smoking number 3. High body mass index is number 4. And high fasting plasma glucose is number 5. What has changed is number 6. Alcohol use has increased rank from 15 to 6. Some dietary factors have decreased rank.
Occupational factors. Occupational.
The occupational are not in the top 17. Yeah.
This is all studies, or this is what?
This is deaths. This is a true. Yeah.
Risk attributable to this.
Yes. So high systolic blood pressure is the leading risk for mortality in Russia. We get a different picture if we look at disability. For YLDs, the leading risk is alcohol use. So high systolic blood pressure is killing more people, but alcohol use is causing more non-fatal disability. High body mass index is high here. High fasting plasma glucose level is increasing, which means more diabetes. Smoking is decreasing in rank. I don't know that it's actually decreasing prevalence very, very much. And again, high systolic blood pressure here. And then this is DALYs. So here we're combining the fatal and the non-fatal to see the overall picture. When we look at this, high systolic blood pressure comes out as number 1. Alcohol use is increased, it's number 2. Smoking is number 3. And then the standard metabolic risks that we see in most developed countries: high BMI, high LDL cholesterol, and high FDG.
Внимание, уважаемые работники и гости.
Администрация сообщает, что в помещении возник пожар. Просим вас, сохраняя спокойствие, спуститься по лестничной клетке на 1-й этаж и выйти на улицу.
Работники и гости.
Администрация сообщает, что в помещении возник пожар. Просим вас, сохраняя спокойствие, спуститься по лестничной клетке на 1-й этаж и выйти на улицу.
Это технически сработала система оповещения в нашем институте, с нами это бывает. В данном случае это техническое.
Сохраняя спокойствие, спуститься по лестничной клетке на 1-й этаж и выйти на улицу.
Ну, тогда пошли пить кофе, потому что next 5 minutes it will be continuing. Okay, coffee break.
Работники и гости.
Администрация сообщает, что в помещении возник пожар.
10 минут.
Спуститься по лестничной клетке на 1-й этаж и выйти на улицу.
Работники и гости.
Администрация сообщает, что в помещении возник пожар. Просим вас, сохраняя спокойствие, спуститься по лестничной клетке на 1-й этаж и выйти.